Let me ask you something. When you hear the word worship, what comes to mind? For some, it's bowing down to a god that demands obedience. For others, it's an act of joy, a reverence, or even love. But here's the thing. Many Quakers today don't believe in God at all and find the word worship deeply uncomfortable. So the question is, why do we still use it? And what does it mean fundamentally for a spiritual community that includes everyone from devout Christians to atheist friends? That's what we're going to be exploring today. So I was reminded of this not so long ago. It was my first ever experience of a Quaker Twitter debate back in the Twitter days. I was new to Twitter then and relatively new to Quakerism and didn't feel I could take part because I didn't know what it was. And it was started by my good friend Mark Russ, unintentionally. And he was questioning, or rather he was stating his view on what worship is, because he was upset that there were some Quakers who wanted to get rid of the word. And so he stated his case, and then it became a big, lots of people from different sides all coming in saying why they like the word worship, why they didn't like the word worship, and on it went in true Twitter style. I was thrilled. I was hooked on this. I was very interested because I hadn't really considered it, really. I'd say by this time I would have considered myself more a Christian Quaker anyway. And so the word didn't really, I was fine with that word. I was flummoxed that there were all these people with quite strong views that we should get rid of the word worship. Since then, I believe Mark has put on his blog, The Jolly Quaker, a response to that, a fleshing out of what his view on the word worship is. He also references Rhiannon Grant, who also on her blog has put something on a similar topic on her blog as well. So I've used those quite a lot in order to help understand this topic. And I'll put the links in the description if you would like to check those out. I'd say that Quaker worship is quite misunderstood by the outside looking in because of the stereotypes that might come with that word. They might look at a British-style Quaker meeting, which is waiting in silence, and think that's not what I think worship should be. This should be like the bowing down and intense praying and all that sort of stuff. However, I would argue that Quakerism is also a place where words really matter. And I think worship is a word that has been particularly caught up in these differing views of what we're doing when we meet. So the objections then are mainly things like people don't like the word because they feel that it is bowing down, submission. It has lots of negative connotations to some people. Some Quakers might fear that it's an alienating word for newcomers, especially if they're coming from atheist or non-theist backgrounds. Mark Russ has this quote where he says that some feel that it's a self-denigration before a tyrant, which are strong words. And more broadly speaking, it invokes these ideas of obedience and of hierarchy as well, which doesn't always sit neatly in the Quaker message. So if it's such a loaded word, should it be one that we keep? Now, both Rhiannon and Mark say, yes, we should. And I do too. So Rhiannon says that words don't carry the same meaning forever. The meaning of words change. Words change over time. And there's, countless examples of that. You can look at, even in the Quaker context, you can look at words like convincement, for example, and inner versus inward light. There has been movement. But what I think she more means is that the meaning of the word has changed, and that's completely normal. What we mean by worship isn't what is meant by worship in that stereotypical version. The phrase meeting for worship doesn't actually tell you what's going on. It's what we call our practice, but it's not a heavily descriptive title of what is going on. Mark talks about the joy that he feels in worship, participating in the song of creation. It's very lyrical. It's a very good blog post. But fundamentally for him, worship is the fundamental reason he goes to meeting, and removing it gets rid of maybe the spiritual depth. I think the problem that a lot of Quakers who maybe are against the word worship, the problem that they might have is, well, what do you actually call it then? What do you call meeting for worship if you don't want to use the word worship? And I would argue that's the fundamental problem for me, is apart from that I like the word worship, I think there isn't really a good alternative, because any other, for example, you can just get rid of worship and just call it meeting, a Quaker meeting. But I think that is incredibly vague, and also doesn't necessarily say, well, what sort of meeting is it? For outsiders, that's confusing because what's going on there. And also amongst Quakers ourselves, we have different types of meetings. You know, we have area meetings, we have business meetings, we have yearly meetings. You know, so what meeting do you mean? I think there's a certain push for ideas like meeting for stillness, meeting for reflection, meeting for contemplation, all those sorts of things. Well, one with meeting for silence or meeting for stillness even, I think that's not what we're meeting for. We're not meeting for stillness, or we're not meeting just for stillness, because otherwise vocal ministry would be highly confusing in that scenario. Similarly with contemplation and those ideas. I think reflection might be the best one out of all those, meeting for reflection. I just feel like Mark does, I kind of feel that would take away rather than adding. And so, yes, worship maybe has some negative connotations there, but I feel what we gain with the word worship, we don't gain much with the phrase reflection or meeting for reflection. An interesting one might be meeting for communion. But then again, I would probably argue that there would be many Quakers who, for the same reasons they don't like worship, also don't like communion. So are we getting any closer? I'm genuinely curious. Are there any things that you think would be a better alternative? Let me know in the comments. Something that Mark is particularly passionate about is, well, he identifies as a Christian Quaker, so it must be said, but he is particularly against what he would call the challenge of pluralism. And he says that there are some good things about pluralism, you know, the fact that every friend, every Quaker can bring their own understanding to worship. So he talks of meeting being like blank canvas. And that can be very liberating, especially for newcomers, for non-theist Quakers. But what he would say is that pluralism isn't neutral, isn't a neutral concept, because pluralism privileges pluralism.
How do we know that there's this spiritual experience that everyone shares? And then there's other problems that come off that, because when you start to emphasize that as the most important thing, all the other aspects of different religious traditions lose their importance. And I've had that in talking with some Quakers about this sort of thing. Like the cross in Christianity has been dismissed as being, well, one Quaker said to me it was a terribly parochial symbol. And I was like, the cross is a central, like, you take the cross out of Christianity. What? So, and that sort of encapsulated this sort of arrogance, really, of being able to say to someone of another tradition, the things you think are most important, they're not actually the most important. The most important thing is actually this spiritual experience that we all share. So I think it can very easily erase difference. Also, I think when you come into dialogue with someone of another faith, if you're taking this pluralist approach, you're sort of saying, how are we the same? Or not even that, you're saying, how are you like me?
It doesn't accept the idea that there might be some people who might want a corporate experience of worship, a unifying corporate experience of it. And so naturally pluralism kind of falls down there, because you can't be saying we open to all views of what worship could mean, but not the one that doesn't accept that all views are all the same. So he gives an analogy that it's like a board game where everyone plays their own version of solitaire. And is that really inclusive, actually, if everyone just plays their own thing on their own? I agree with him, but I don't think it's as important for me, because I've seen that it does work from experience. I've seen that there can be Quakers that, and even though we're sitting in meeting and we're doing different things and we believe different things, there's something to be said by that. I think the corporateness of that silence and of that space. And I think that in many ways is enough. I suppose there's an argument to be said that maybe we need to reclaim the word worship as a Quaker word. I've talked about that before ages ago now. I think that was one of my first videos on reclaiming the word quaking. On the other hand, you know, we're not beyond changing important phrases in Quakerism. So in Britain, for example, I know it's not necessarily the case in America. We moved away from calling monthly meetings because quite often they didn't happen monthly. So we've now moved that to area meetings. Rhiannon also says that I don't think it'd be interesting to poll Quakers on what they actually think of this word. But I don't think it's certainly not a universal dislike of this word, in a way that area meeting became just a logical thing to call it because we weren't meeting monthly, so it was obviously wrong. And I was just thinking about when I came to Quakers, and not in particularly religious in any way, I just accepted that word. Now, admittedly, I didn't have the baggage. But I think many newcomers just accept that that's what it's called. That's what you do. How you interpret that word is up to you, in the same way that a lot of interpretation and discernment is personal. But it would be a big change. And so changing it, I think there would have to be a greater amount of people who would be against this word for that change to be worth it. And what Mark actually calls for, which I think is great, as a linguist, is that he wants there to be more words, not fewer words. And if we limit down and just call it meeting, then that just takes away all the options. I mean, maybe we should have all of these options that I mentioned before and more. Maybe we should just call them all these things. And we all know what we're talking about when we say meeting for worship, meeting for reflection, whatever. But it doesn't. Why limit ourselves when we could, in fact, make it broader, make it more exciting, and make words more Quaker? So maybe if that word isn't comfortable, what might be some tips as to how to come to terms with that word in a Quaker setting? One suggestion that is given out is seeing the word worship from its actual root as worthship. And so that means attending to what is valuable and of worth. You might also consider it maybe a cultural inheritance. Loads of, if you think about lots of the Quaker vocabulary and phrases that we use, they are mostly Christian. But that's our heritage. We're not going to get rid of phrases like Christ has come to teach his people himself, that of God and everyone. There is even one Christ Jesus who can speak to your condition. There's all these phrases. We're not going to get rid of them. So it's about just accepting if you are challenged by that this is a cultural inheritance. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you have to carry on believing if you don't want to. It's not a personal demand in any way. It might be worth, for those people who do really value the word worship, explaining why it does mean a lot to them. Because I think if people think it doesn't really matter, then maybe people might think we should change it. We need, if we do think it's worthwhile, we need to explain why it's worthwhile and what we see is in terms of the deep meaning behind that word and the experience that we feel when we are worshipping. And again, I always say, and I feel we have to do an awful lot as liberal Quakers, you just have to hold that tension, because I think ultimately meeting for worship, or whatever you want to call it, is a place for listening. It's not a place for erasure. And I think if that's what we're going to be doing, then I think that sets a very weird precedent as Quakers. So it's a really important word, and I think it's important enough to keep. I think we can give it a Quaker take. I think we can see how that has affected Quakers throughout our history and the importance of that word. I don't think that it needs to be the only word we call it, and if people want to call it other things, I'm all for that. I think there are some better ones than others. Ultimately, I think getting rid of words is not a very Quaker thing to do if it's not truly speaking to what is going on. And I think worship is good enough to explain what's going on in a Quaker meeting. So I want to thank both Mark and Rhiannon for their excellent blog posts. Check them out. And thank you very much for watching, everyone. I'll see you in the next video.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.